Hello, seventh graders. We're going to be talking about adding some color to your Mona Lisa parody. Now, before we get started, this drawing should look somewhat familiar. This is a Elsa Mona Lisa parody. And of course, I started it with a simple pencil. I had an eraser that I used, and then once I was done working with those two items, I outlined everything with a ultra fine tip Sharpie. And then in some areas, I used a fine tip Sharpie. So if you would like to do that step, you're welcome to do it. It's up to you which one you use. You could even use a really nice pen if you have one. Now to add color, I'm going to be using colored pencils. You could also use markers. I'm going to leave that choice up to you. Before we get started with our coloring today, I'm going to show you a few common mistakes you can make no matter what it is that you're coloring. So I've got a card here with some really common mistakes that you can make when you're coloring. Our first one is coloring outside of the lines. This normally happens because maybe you are not taking your time, coloring a little bit too quickly, and you go outside of those designated lines that you made. The next one is stopping short of the lines. So this one normally happens because you're afraid of going outside of the lines. Now what can happen when this happens is that you get this fuzzy looking edge, and if you look at this one, it almost looks like a fuzzy pom-pom. Here we've got uneven pressure. Now uneven pressure happens when you're pressing down really hard in some spots, and then normally maybe your hand gets tired, or maybe your colored pencil starts to kind of dull, and you start to ease up on the pressure and you get these lighter spots here. Lastly, we've got gaps and directional change. Gaps and directional change normally happen when you're moving your hand too quickly, and maybe if you're making your movements too big, slowing your hand down and making smaller movements normally helps with gaps and directional change. Down here at the bottom, you'll see we've got a nice smooth circle. We do not see any coloring outside the lines. We're not stopping short of the lines. We don't have any uneven pressure, and we don't see any gaps or directional change. So for our next step, I want to talk to you about outlining and then adding some color. Now the first thing I did when I was done with my pencil step was that I did go ahead and I outlined with an ultra fine tip, and you can see that the lines look a little thinner in the designs over here. And then I actually used a thicker marker to do certain portions of Elsa's dress, her sash, and her hair. Now you do not have to mix those up. You can just stick with one of the ultra fine tip or fine tip markers. That's up to you. Once I was done with those items, I came in with an eraser, and I erased any stray pencil marks that I could see. Sometimes when you go over something with a Sharpie, you don't always get it right on top of the line, so it is helpful to do that erasing step just so you erase any graphite that you don't want to show. All right, once you've done those, we are ready to start with some colored pencils. So let's talk about that next. Now that we are done with that step, it is time to add some color. Now I'm going to be using colored pencils, but if you'd like to, you could also use markers or any other materials you have that you think would work well for this. I'm going to be starting with this lighter blue here, and then later I'm going to be adding some value with this darker blue. So to start off, I'm going to work in this section right here, and I'm going to start by outlining this area right up next to the edge that I have outlined with marker. Now what I'm doing here is creating a sort of barrier, an outline that will help prevent me from both going over the lines and stopping short of the lines. Notice I'm going to move my hands kind of slowly. I'm making small movements with my colored pencil, and I'm going right up next to that edge. around the braid here. Keep in mind before you start working, it's always a great idea to sharpen your colored pencils. If you do think you'd like to use markers, test those out first. Make sure that your markers aren't drying up on you, because you don't want to start coloring and then have to stop because your marker stopped working. Started to look too light and dried up. All right, so in this section here, I'm just gonna start by outlining this area. Now I'm gonna color in the center. Now the key to this is making sure that when you do color in the center, you don't make it too light or too dark. You want it to match that outline you put around the edge. Otherwise you're gonna be able to see it. Whenever I use colored pencils, I always like to start off with light pressure. Don't press down too hard. Not only is that hard on your hand, but if you make it too dark to start out with, you might have a hard time going back and making changes if you want to. You can always make your coloring darker if you feel like it's a little bit too light later on. Okay, we are almost done. Elsa's sash is looking pretty good. Remember, watch out for those gaps, watch out for those directional changes, and watch out for that uneven pressure. I'm gonna bring my colored pencil back over some spots and just kind of lightly skim over some areas that I think look a little uneven, just to try and make it all look nice and smooth. All right, well, there you go. Elsa's sash is started, but let's go ahead and finish it up. So for this next step, I just want to show you a technique that you can use if you'd like to, but it's not required. If I look at the sash here thrown over Elsa's arm, you can see that it looks fine, but there are some areas that kind of blend in with the areas around it because we're not seeing any value or shading. Now these are the two colors that I'm going to use for this, and if you would like to add value or shading, there's two ways to do that. I'm going to set my darker color aside for a moment. I'm going to take my lighter blue, and to add a little bit of value, I'm going to start down in this section here. I'm just going to add a little bit more pressure. Adding a little bit of shading in this spot is going to help us see the difference between where her arm is and where the sash is falling behind her. Now I'm not going to make the whole area dark. What I'm going to do is make it darker up here and then gradually get lighter as it comes down by easing up on the pencil. So I'm pressing down harder up here and easing up as I go down, just kind of skimming the pencil along the paper. So that's one way to add some value. Another way to add some value is to take a color, a darker color, preferably one that's similar to the color you've already used, and you can layer it right on top of the first color. And then again, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to press down a little bit darker or harder up here at the top, and then ease up as I come down towards the bottom of the shape. And now you can see we've got some value. So let's go ahead and we'll finish up the rest of Elsa's sash and maybe even some other parts. Well, 7th graders, Elsa is coming right along. You can see I added some coloring or some shading into her sash. Also down below her hands and arms here on the dress. And then back behind where the sash lays over her torso, I added some shading to show that it was behind the piece of cloth. Now I still have a little bit of work to do. Up here in this snowflake design, I've got one more left that I've got to color, and then I'm going to go back in. I'm going to add a little bit of shading into the silver areas. I'm also going to add a little bit of shading into this area here that's white. And to do that, I'm actually going to be using a dark gray color because when white falls into shadow, it looks like a gray. All right, have fun creating your Mona Lisa parody designs. I cannot wait to see what you come up with. Bye.